We are one of the biggest podcasters in New Zealand, got a huge audience. But in trying to build another channel, it's hard. And it's quite sobering when you're used to all these big numbers and then you release these new episodes and you're sort of starting from the bottom again and you're building. Can we repeat? Can we employ the same strategies on this channel to grow the audience from scratch?
Welcome back to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast as a hobby in 2019, just because I was bored one day and I was like, hey, I love podcasts. Let's start a podcast. That show, a Vietnam podcast, went on to be in the top 10% of podcasts around the world. And I got to meet some incredible people, but most of all, I got to learn some amazing skills that I never, ever thought I would learn. And so from a Vietnam podcast in 2019, I started my own podcast production business called 7 Million Bytes Podcast. And we've now helped over 50 podcasts around the world, produced over 700 episodes, helped with millions of downloads, and even helped several podcasts get to the top of the Apple podcast charts. So in this podcast, Smarter Podcasting, I wanted to share with you tips and tricks that I've learned and other experts have learned in the field of podcasting to help you make the best podcast possible. Now, in this episode today, I'm really, really excited to share something that I think every single podcast wants to learn, and that is how to grow their podcast and how to get more listeners. It's the holy grail of podcasting. So my guest today, I'm really, really excited to talk to someone from New Zealand, being a token Kiwi myself. But what is really inspirational is earlier this year, he actually resigned from his job as a premium sports editor at the New Zealand Herald, which is a massive newspaper in New Zealand, if you don't know. And he decided to go all in on his podcast, the Between Two Beers podcast. Now, like me, this started in 2019. I started my podcast in my front room. He started in his garage, and 4 years later, won the Voyager Media Award for the best episodic podcast. And in 2023, was ranked in both the Apple and Spotify's top 10 podcasts of the year in New Zealand across all categories. Not only that, in 2024, they won the Best Society and Culture podcast at the New Zealand Radio and Podcast Awards. And this is going to blow your mind. They have clocked over 3 million downloads. Now, remember, population of New Zealand is only 5 million. So that means most people in New Zealand have listened to this podcast. But what I think is the best is not only all of that success, they've been able to take their podcast audience and formed a platform for really exciting extensions of the business and be able to monetize in a different way. So today we're going to talk about how to grow your podcast to get all of that amazing success. My guest today is the host of the Between Two Beers podcast, Steve Holloway. Thank you for joining us on Smarter Podcasting, Steve.
Cheers, Neil. It's a hell of an intro. I hope I can do it justice.
I'm absolutely sure you can. So we connected, like many people, on LinkedIn, and I saw that you'd posted about this incredible podcast growth. Tell us a little bit about your expectations when you started, because as I mentioned, it's almost similar with mine, and I had no expectations starting back in 2019.
Yeah, the origins of our podcast started in my Hamilton garage in Glenview, Hamilton, 2019. And it was me and my best friend from school, Seamus, and we just decided we were both very inquisitive people, and we just decided that we wanted to start a long form podcast and ask people about the most interesting and insightful parts of their lives. So to start with, we had no ambitions of anything. Like, we didn't care who listened, we didn't care. We didn't try to make any money from it. It was just genuinely, let's get people in a room, and a microphone gave us permission to ask them about their lives. And so the first 20 guests were just Hamilton battlers, people you'd have no idea about. It was my brother-in-law and my high school teacher. We had my dad and, guys we played football with. But we would get to areas of their lives which we wouldn't have talked about otherwise. Our second guest was my high school teacher, Paul Nixon, and he had 4 kids. His wife passed away of cancer, and he raised those kids by himself. And I've got 4 kids, and it was a part of his life that I'd always wanted to talk about, but I've never quite found the right time or place. But we invited him over and we said, Paul, you're going to join us for 90 minutes and we're going to talk about your life. This is going to be one part of it. And I remember in that second episode thinking, holy shit, we're on to something here. And yeah, over 5 years, it kind of expanded. It went away from football and we started doing broadcasters and comedians and entertainers. And yeah, to fast forward to current day, birthday is next month. We're doing a live show. We're both full time in the business, and it's grown beyond any of our wildest dreams. And part of the reason why is because I think we had no expectation. You know, we didn't make any money out of the podcast game for at least 3 years, and we kept going. We kept turning up because it was our favorite part of the week. And so, like, I think that sort of fundamental basis of because we enjoyed it is why we're still here today.
It's just so inspirational, everything you're saying. It's almost giving me goosebumps. There's so many good things. I think the first thing is just summing up the beauty of podcasting is being able to talk to people and scratch beneath the surface and find out something that you would never really know, because this again is really similar why I started. So I'm based in Saigon in Vietnam, and I was meeting all these incredible people with, as soon as you got a little glimpse of their backstory, they were like a rock and roll star that had been touring all of America. They worked in leather work and made wallets and belts, and or they worked in arts and crafts, or they'd studied law or something. But most of them were teachers. And what really annoyed me is there's still a thing that people say, "Oh, I'm just a teacher." And I'm like, You're not just a teacher. Like, don't put yourself down like that." But also, they have this incredible story. So that's how I started as well, just sitting down with a microphone in my front room. And I was like, I want to share your story with people. And even now, when I sit down with somebody, you're going to have a conversation that you'll probably never have with them. You would never sit down in the pub and be like, right, tell me about, your four kids in your life. And it's just, you can get really beneath the surface. I love that you started with no expectations. And it's good to share with people that it can take years, if ever, to make some money from it. And you've just got to do it with love and with passion. And there's something crazy about podcasting that I just love as a medium.
Yeah, the consistency element of it is, I think, the underlying principle of making it. And we are in the 1%. Most people, I know, I'm sure you're familiar with all the stats of the amount of people that try to start podcasts and don't sort of continue with it. And it really is turning up everywhere. And I look back to like what our show was in that first year, in those first 20 episodes, to what it is now, and it's evolved into this totally different thing. Like even the name Between Two Beers, we used to think the most important part of our show was that we would share a six pack through it, and the second half of the podcast would get a bit looser, and we'd be on the piss. Now my co-host doesn't drink. Like he went sober 2 years into the journey. So we're sponsored by Export Gold. We've got this podcast called Between Two Beers, but I'm the only one that's drinking. And now I very rarely even have a beer. And so we're on it. We were thinking about, do we change the name? You know, we've got this brand has been built up and it's got great recognition and respect, but it's not really who we are anymore. So anyway, we've been through it and we've framed it as it's not about the beer. It's that we have the sort of conversations you would have over a beer. And it's, it's light and it can be heavy and it can be serious, but it's kind of the you might catch up with a long lost mate and say, let's go for a beer. And it's a different kind of conversation because you're going to traverse a wide range of topics. So that's how we've justified staying between two beers despite not really drinking beers in the show.
When you were drinking beers on the show, did you have like a preconceived plan? Did you have an outline for the show, or anything that you knew you were going to cover, or it was just a chat and see where it goes?
No, I think this has been our biggest point of difference when I look at other podcasters is we put so much time into the preparation for each episode, and we think so much about what we're going to cover and what order we're going to cover it. If there's something really serious, we're going to build into it and come out somewhere light on the other side. So we kind of like really storyboard each episode. And so between Seamus and I, if we've got a guest on now, we will listen to every podcast I've been on. We'll read all the news articles. We'll scan their social media feeds. But I think the biggest point of difference is that we will try to physically call 4 or 5 people in their lives to get the best inside lines of stories that other people wouldn't know about, sort of fundamental, why they are the way they are, or some just great stories that'll just sort of break the ice at the start. And you bring that all together, and then we each have an idea of how we think the episode will structure, and we have like an hour long chat, and we work through why this would work and why this wouldn't. And it amounts to what feels like just a very easygoing conversation between, 3 people. But in our minds, we know we've got sort of 7 or 8 landing spaces that we're going to move to, and in between that, we've got the freedom to go wherever we want. So it feels like there's not much planning going on, but really behind the scenes, it's all planned.
Oh, I absolutely love that. If you can see the massive smile on my face for a couple of reasons. One is my advice to people would be never do a podcast where you're just going to get drunk or stoned and you hear people do that. Like, I'm just going to get drunk with my friend and record it. And you're like, that's just a terrible idea. Like, I remember that I heard somebody make a comparison, said, if people want to listen to drunk people having a conversation, they can just go down to any pub and overhear a conversation. You're not going to tune into a podcast to hear that. So it is then to hear that obviously yours is not like that, that you have this planned out, that level of preparation though was incredible. But what you said and what I absolutely love is the listener will have probably zero idea of the amount that has gone in to make that possible, the amount of work and preparation. And for me, I've focused, my main passion is the editing side of it and making every episode sound so professional. And I even was listening back to an episode that I'd edited recently, and it taken about an hour and a half of audio down to 20 minutes. And I was listening to it and I forgot that it had been edited because it sounded so seamless. And I was like, this is what the listener's going to hear. They're just going to hear this and think it's just 20 minutes of straight chat, when in reality, there was so much garbage on there and stuff that had been cut out. And I think that's what I love, that I think that's what you're saying as well, is the listener will have no idea what level of preparation you've gone in to make an amazing episode for them.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Here, some podcasters say they don't like to know too much about their guests because they like to sort of be in the moment and be surprised by it. Where we operate from a totally different point of view. We like to know everything about our guests because what we're basically doing is aggregating the best parts of their lives and the best stories. So a listener will turn up, and it might be the first time they've heard them talk, but they'll get a 90-minute or 2 hour package and just be like, "Holy shit, that was awesome! That was so good." Because we've crafted it that way. Because we have stolen all of the best bits of their life and just brought it together. So we're kind of like an aggregator of stories. But the other thing we do differently is, and this was a conscious decision we made right at the start. Like it's not about us. Like it's not about us as the host. So over time, we've refined it where we put so much emphasis into asking the best questions and figuring out what the best question is to ask this guest, and basically totally remove ourselves from it. So despite doing mountains and mountains of research, we don't appear like it's for us to shine. It's just to make the guest shine. And over time, people pick up on it and they start to feel like they get to know it. We give a little bit of ourselves away in each episode, but for the loyal listeners that have listened to 200 of them, they feel like they know us really well. They're putting little pieces of the jigsaw together.
No, I absolutely love it. So I'm really terrible. So I'm actually personally the opposite to you. So I'm one of those people that I do like to kind of have that natural reaction. I like to explore the conversation. When I do my show, a Vietnam podcast, which is completely different to this one, and a Vietnam podcast, I talk to people connected to Vietnam, whether they're Vietnamese, VQ, expats, foreigners, but the central thread is they're connected to Vietnam. So that's the main context for the story, and we're going to talk about that. I think I do rely on skills I didn't know I had, and natural skills as an interviewer to be able to guide that conversation. And I do try and ask some maybe slightly difficult questions to try and get that story out of them. I wish I had the time to do all of the things that you've described, because I also have interviewed Jordan Harbinger and he's given almost the same answer as you. He would read people's books like from page to page to learn every single thing about them. So just for if people listening might think like be intimidated or overwhelmed, like I don't have the time to do that. You can still do a podcast without having to read their book or every social media post, but I definitely can see why it would make such a difference to the flow of the show and to the guest. And that what you said as well, which I think is a really great point, is not inserting yourself too much in the show. So I would do this too as well, that I would try and keep my contributions to about 10 to 20%. And you can see it when you edit it, how much the guest has spoken and how much you've spoken, because I wanted to highlight them and share their story. And it's exactly like you said, if you do it for long enough, and I've done about 200 odd episodes as well, people will get to know you. And I kind of forget that. Like, how do they know so much about me? But if they listen enough, they're going to get like a little bit, even though you're putting the guest forward, right?
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I should say like this is just the way we do it, and it works for us, but is in no way casting any shadows on how anyone else operates. There's so many different brilliant ways to do a podcast. We've just found a way that works for us. So yeah, we sort of like found the recipe and we stick to it.
No, I mean, I think it's probably the best way to do it if you can. My main advice is always to say to people, don't do a podcast about everything and anything, and don't do it drunk or stoned. So if you're sitting there and you're planning out your content and you're having a couple of beers, that's fine. And I generally had a rule up until recently that I didn't drink in pod. I was actually talking about this yesterday, was because I remember one time I had one beer and I couldn't keep track in my head, because you've really got to actively listen. You've got to think like, what's the next question coming? And I remember I just had one beer while we were doing it, and immediately I was like, it made me so scatty, I guess. And I was like, that's it. That was way in the beginning, and I was like, I'm not doing that. But now I've just started adding a second episode to the show. It's called the Saigon Sunday Sessions, and as a Kiwi in Australia, we all know, and the Brits, we all know what a Sunday session is, right? It's when you go and have a few beers. The show is not based around that, and they're not always recorded on a Sunday, but we release them on a Sunday, and it is a bit more casual and a bit looser. We still have a central topic that we decide before the episode, like this is what is going to be the main theme, but we can have a couple of beers while we're doing it, and the guests can have a couple of beers, and it's introduced as this is a bit of a more of a casual catch up, but it's still not as casual as I thought it would be, because I just cannot innately let it, just be too casual, because it's like, no, we need to go back to the central topic. So let's go back to the Two Beers podcast. What I love is at some point you decided we're going to go all in. What did that mean, and how did you do it?
Yeah, it kind of happened in steps. What all in mean was leaving my job at the Herald that I'd had for 12 years and going out on our own. And I've got 4 kids and a mortgage, and that's a big thing to do. That's a big responsibility to take on. But I needed to sort of pull my big boy pants up and take the step. So that's kind of the end of it. But to get there, it took probably 2 years. And so we had this phase where we were really happy with the product we had. We thought we were doing a great job with the podcast, but we didn't really have a platform to promote ourselves on. We hadn't done a great job of building our social media channels. I think across Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok at the time it was around, we probably had less than 1,000 followers across all of them. So we're like, well, how do we get on the radar of more people? And in New Zealand, there's a media organisation called NZME, and part of that is the ACC. It's called the Alternative Commentary Collective, and they do kind of like alternative commentary for cricket and rugby, and they're kind of like sport entertainment, but they have a huge social footprint. So they had 200,000 followers on Facebook and 100,000 on Instagram. So we thought if we can get in under their umbrella, and if we can get our shows sort of marketed or promoted on their channels, it will open us up to a wider audience. And once they hear of us, once they discover one of our episodes, they'll go back and look through our back catalogue and find hopefully more guests that appeal to them, which are timeless. That was our strategy. It was like, let's just get out there. So we linked up with the ACC, and then we had to put a lot of resource and the small amount of money we were making into marketing. We needed to get better at social media quickly because Seamus and I are good at talking to people. We're not good at social media. So we had this meeting with this guy Marcus, and he now, since then, we were his first podcast client. He now works with, I think, 5 of the biggest podcasts in New Zealand, and he is absolutely killing the space. But we sat down with him and he gave us like a 1 hour strategy pitch. And it was the most comprehensive, impressive thing I think I've seen in my life. And he was like, at this rate, you'll get to 3,000 followers in 10 years. If you do my strategy, we'll get there, in 6 months, whatever it is. So we backed him, and it was a huge leap of faith for us because at this point we were not making a lot of money. We might have been making, I don't know, between 2 and 3 grand a month as in podcast income. That was from sponsorship and ads, and yeah, not a lot, but what do we do with it? And we basically gave it all to Marcus, and we said, okay, we want to reinvest in video. We want to put emphasis on making little reels and trailers and clips for each episode, and we want to push them on the ACC social channels, so Facebook and Instagram. And at the same time, we're going to be building our own channel. So this is kind of like the long-term play. And and so we did it for 2 years. And as our guests started getting better, some of the clips would go viral and we'd pick up some new followers. So we were getting new listeners through the ACC, but at the same time, we were starting to build our own channels. And I think if we fast forward to now, I think we've got about 100,000 followers across all of our different channels. And all of our resources put into creating the most captivating trailer to hook in listeners. Plus, we do 3 or 4 clips for each episode. But because we built up all of these small channels ourselves at the same time, now one piece of content goes across Facebook and Instagram and YouTube Shorts and TikTok and LinkedIn and Twitter. So it's one piece spread across 6 different platforms. And it's worked.
No, that was music to my ears because this is what we do for our channels, and this is what we recommend to people. So 7 Million Bikes Podcast helps businesses mostly produce podcasts to help their business or marketing. And that's exactly what we tell them as well. Let's make a video. Let's make a YouTube video. Then we're going to take the audio from the video. Then we're going to take the YouTube video, make it into lots of little clips, share them across all platforms. And you can go from having this one piece of content and you're getting 100 to 1,000 times more eyeballs in front of it from just that one piece of content. My question is going to be though, for people listening who don't know much about the ACC, I obviously do know the ACC, and they're one of the one of the funniest groups of sports commentators you'll ever come across. They are highly inappropriate most of the time because what they do is they commentate on a cricket game, for example, and they don't really commentate on the sports action. They're just dropping, I was going to say double entendres. I don't even know the double entendres. They're just entendres, if that's a thing. But did you have to make a conscious decision then to link up with them, thinking that this content? I know it turns off a lot of people. I've heard the ACC talk about when they are played on is it Sky Plus or what the Sky channel is. People will complain, "How do I turn this off?" And they don't realize you just have to press the red button, then you can go back to like the normal commentary.
Yeah. They're larrikins, the ACC lads. But there's 2 things. So our show has evolved a lot from when we first joined the ACC to what it is now. But at the same time, we were only in bed with them to the extent that they were promoting it on their channels. So anyone that was seeing our stuff was already a fan of ACC because they were following them. I don't think the algorithms were quite where they are at the moment. So so first of all, no issue with what they do, and it very much aligned with who we were at the time, which was majority sport podcasts and entertainment, right? We get guests on and we try to tell their funniest stories, which is pretty aligned with ACC. We are no longer with the ACC, and it's a very mutual split, and there's no hard feelings either way. It's just that we sort of started taking the show in a different direction, and so now I would say maybe 40 or 50% of our guests are sport, but 50% aren't. So we have the Top Twins on, who are 2 very famous New Zealand lesbian singers, or we had like this incredible Afghani refugee who was an asylum seeker talking about his plight, or cancer survivors. And that's not aligned with sports entertainment anymore, and we kind of like weren't really sort of meshing as a brand. So we're still with NZME, but we're with iHeart, which is more sort of a better fit. It's everything. It's everything for everyone. So that's kind of the home. But no issues at all with the ACC's brand. And like I said, like we have changed a lot over the years, but where we were at the time, it was the perfect home for us, I think.
And I guess the point there, which is brilliant, that when you are looking at working with sponsors or linking up with a media agency, I think you do really need to look at like, does this align with our beliefs and our values? I mean, I'm not saying that the ACC didn't; they absolutely did. But I just think it is something that all podcasters need to take into consideration, and they don't just jump into bed with the first person that is like, "Hey, we'll promote your podcast," or "We'll do this."
Yeah, and it can be really hard sort of coming up through the gears of podcasting because it's really hard. It's really, really hard to first make any money from it. Second, build an audience. It's just like people will come and ask for podcasting advice, and I'm like, you gotta be thinking long. If you're starting a podcast, you've got to be thinking about the 100th episode already, because it's going to be a long, slow game to build that audience, and it will build through being good and consistency and word of mouth. But it's going to take a long time to build. So you need to be going into it with that mindset, I think.
I've ranted about this before. One of my biggest pet peeves is when I read a blog post and it's like top 10 side hustles. And one of them will be like, start your own podcast. And you're like, this, if you are getting into podcasting because you want to make money as a side hustle, as you said, it's going to take you 3 to 5 years of consistent hard work. It's going to cost you money. And so it really frustrates me when people list podcasting as a side hustle. And I think that came up a lot during the pandemic. The other one that annoys me is start a blog, as if it's something that you can just do for a 20 minutes. I'd like building a blog and SEO and everything like that takes so much time and energy. So I love it. You do have to just be consistent and continue to put out good content.
Yeah, so an interesting one is we've launched a second podcast channel. So we've got our main channel, which is Between Two Beers, but now that we're business owners, we thought it would be quite interesting bringing the listeners along with us as we're trying to figure it all out. Like we're the everyman. We're two guys who had regular jobs and now we're kind of doing the thing. But along the way, like the growth curve Seamus and I have both been on the last 12 months has been insane. So we're kind of talking about it quite openly on this new channel we've created, which is called Business in Between. And we've got a business and mindset coach who we had been using before we started the podcast. And we're like, oh, she's amazing. She's this weapon of a human called Di. We had her on our main channel. She had terminal cancer, was given a 0% chance of lasting more than 12 months. Is still here 13 years later. So on her own, she's got an incredible story, but the dynamic between the three of us just brings out like all of the real struggles we're going through. But the point of telling you this is that even us, right? So we are one of the biggest podcasters in New Zealand, got a huge audience. But in trying to build another channel, it's hard and it's quite sobering when you're used to all these big numbers and then you release these new episodes and you're sort of starting from the bottom again and you're building. And so that is our test at the moment. We've only been live about 3 months, but it's can we repeat? Can we employ the same strategies on this channel to grow the audience from scratch? And because we have done it and because we know it's a long game, like I'm just so confident we are going to be the biggest business podcast in New Zealand. It's just a matter of when, because we're in it for the long game. Like we're thinking everything is being thought of in this like 5 year plan. So yeah, I'm sort of experiencing what it's like to build an audience again, but quite enjoying the game of it.
It's really crazy hearing your story because I think our stories are so similar. So my show, a Vietnam podcast, doesn't get the numbers like you get for the Two Beers podcast, but it's relatively successful, and I never really expected that. Started with no expectations, but I've started two other podcasts since then. One was a comedy podcast because I'm a stand-up comedian, and that we did that for about 25 episodes, and that was just for fun. It was called "Did That Really Happen?" And again, it was just a personal thing. I would even before I started doing comedy, anytime I heard a comedian say a joke, I would be like, "Did that really happen? Like, did that?" And then often I would ask them if I would meet them after the show, and I'd be like, "That joke you told, did that really happen?" And 9 times out of 10, they're like, "Yep, no, 100%. I couldn't make that up." I remember it happened when we lived in Wellington. We were at the Big Coomera, I think it was called, on Dixon Street in Wellington, and we saw this hilarious comedian. And yeah, that after the show, I went up to him and I was like, "Did that really happen?" And I remember his answer was like, "There is no way I could make that story up. I'm not that funny. I'm not that creative. Like it absolutely happened." So I would invite comedians on. I would play one of their jokes, and then I would ask them, "Did that really happen?" And then with this show, Smarter Podcasting, we've been going for over a year now. I was a bit inconsistent in the beginning, and again, it's that consistency. So now we're posting on a consistent basis every 2 weeks, and we really uh, got the content down better, what we want to share. But it is really sobering. So to go from a Vietnam podcast, which is still going and is getting bigger and getting more numbers, and as I said, we've just started doing a second episode now every week, to then go to Smarter Podcasting, you're going right back to the beginning. But again, it's you remind yourself, like, I've done this before and I know it can be done again, and I just need to follow the same steps. And it's just patience and waiting. And even with this channel, I do it because I love it. I love talking to people like yourself, learning. Personally, it's a selfish channel. Like, I love learning from people like yourself, but then sharing these tips with other podcasters, I just think is so invaluable. And you mentioned as well something that we've always aimed on with it, a Vietnam podcast, and this podcast is providing evergreen content so that you can listen to this episode in a year or 2 years or 5 years, and the information hasn't changed. I had somebody actually going back to talking about who you get in bed with, or so to speak. Somebody contacted me this week and said, "Hey, we've got a performance, like a dance show coming up this month or next month in November. Would you want to do an episode with some of our dancers?" And I was like, I would love to do an episode, but I don't do events because it's going to be out of date in a month. And I actually have all my guests planned out for the rest of the year anyway. But next year, absolutely, I would. The topic is amazing. I'm just not going to promote your show unless you want to pay for advertising.
Yeah, always take your money. Yeah, I think the point you made there that you love it, yeah, and it's got to be selfish as well. It's got to be, you've got to learn and get something from it yourself, because it just won't survive otherwise. It just won't. Unless you're already a household name and you got a big backing behind you. But like, I think we're launching this new podcast now, but we have processes in place. Like, we've got a team working on it. There's three of us, and we divvy up the roles and responsibilities. And we've got our marketing guy can help with the videos, and we've got an audio guy that helps with the sound quality. Like, we're at a much different place. But in those first 3 years, that was me doing everything. I was cutting up the edits, and I was, yeah, everything that's involved with it, writing the intros and putting the ad markers in and reaching out to advertisers. And I remember getting quite overwhelmed at times. It's like, "Ooh, we had this amazing episode, but now I've got so much work I've got to do before I get it out." And you kind of got to go through that to know. I think you've got to sort of go through that passage to get good, and then you can start, outsourcing it and getting your time back. But it's a ride.
Again, very, very similar story. I mean, I started doing everything by myself, and now I have a small team as well, and they're going to do most of the work, but I still do some of it because I absolutely love the editing part of it. But it does make things much, much quicker, easier. And I remember a few years ago, somebody asked me, "How long does it take you to make a podcast episode?" I was like, I actually have never worked it out. So I wrote it down, and I was like, right, booking the guest, preparing for the episode, setting up all the equipment, recording the episode is a small part of it. Then you've got to edit the episode, promote it, publish it, all of this. And once I wrote it all down, I was like, it's about 10 hours of work for one episode. And the amount of prep that you're doing as well, you could probably double that. That's half a week's work. Like, most people work 40 hours a week. So that's 1 to 2 days of work for something that you're doing on top of your job. So that was a big eye opener. And that's again why when people get into podcasting and they say, "Oh, I work with a lot of podcasters," and often the first question is, "How do I monetize?" And I'm like, it's not going to be easy. It's hard to tell somebody, especially if they're hiring you as a service, to be like, it's not easy. Like, you're not gonna monetize in the first week. Like, that's just, you're getting into it for the wrong reasons. But I understand why you're asking the question.
Yeah, it's, and I don't want to sound like doom and gloom, like it's, don't start a podcast. It's just, you need to really go in with your eyes open and really be dialed in to, like, what your point of difference is, right? Like, the market is so saturated now. There are so many podcasts out there. Why in this competition for ears is someone going to tune into your show? Like, what is it? Like, sell it. Like, what is the selling point? Don't just start. I mean, you can just start if you've got a 5 year lens and sort of find your feet as you go. But yeah, it's going to be a long project, and you've got to be special and you've got to be good to hold listeners. And also the listening experience. If they do tune into one episode and it's no good, they're not going to come back. So, like, we've always thought we've got to keep that bar super high, because any chance to pick up a new listener, that we've got to convert them. They've got to have loved it enough to go back and listen to more. So it's just got to be really good. And whatever format, doesn't need to be 2 hour epics like ours. It could be a little 10-minute or 20-minute bite-sized thing, but it's got to be good.
And I want to pick up on one last thing that you mentioned, which again shows podcasting is more than just getting behind a microphone. You mentioned about all the other things that you had to do and you've had to learn or outsource. What are some of those tasks that you've learned along the way when you were doing it all by yourself? And even now, when you have a small team and you're able to outsource some of those tasks, what are they that is required to make a successful podcast?
So video is a big part of it. So when I was doing it myself, when we were recording the episodes, I would make little notes just to say, and this is quite specific to us because we do these 2 hour podcasts. So to listen back through a 2 hour podcast is 2 hours of your time. So I'd make little sort of notes on the paper, if the guest was saying something particularly interesting, just the timestamp on it. And then afterwards, I would go back and I would edit myself in Adobe Premiere Pro. And I just cut out the little clips and I think, okay, there's 3 bits of content. Now we have this marketing guy, Marcus. His team does that, so they listen back through. He's got the eye in the ear for what works on social media. Really cleverly designed, so they have a little hook at the start and a payoff at the end, and try to make it less than a minute. Try to engage and get people to share it. So there's a real art to that, which is kind of at the level we're at now. But in the early days, it was just about finding little bits that we thought would resonate with our the intro. We put a lot of thought into the intro, and I think if I can be quite critical of what we do, I've perhaps gotten a bit comfortable with it. Like we have a structure because when you're doing it every week, it can be quite overwhelming to even if you're not from a writing. I mean, I'm from a writing background, and I still struggle with it. So if you're not, to think about how to summarize an episode and make it punchy can be quite overwhelming. So we sort of fit into a structure. It's like this week on blah blah blah, blah blah blah. I've done this, and in this episode we talk about this, and you try to make it crisp and punchy, but like that's one part of it that you don't think. And then that's, well, how do we promote it on social media? What is the sort of the caption that goes along with the post? Or if there's a video, what hashtags are we using? There's all that side of it as well. Yeah, so there's a lot. Also, I mean, this is another sort of, which is perhaps quite specific for me, but because I was working at the Herald, I would write stories about our articles and publish them on the Herald with links to our podcast, and I'd try to embed the podcast episode in there. If you are in a place where you have got a podcast guest who has said something newsworthy, write it up yourself and send it to as many places as you can, because any way that
Wow.
you can catch eyeballs or get someone's attention or drive traffic to your podcast is a good thing. Any way you can do it, find a way.
That is a great one. So you would suggest writing like because I'd only learned I was gonna say recently, but maybe 10 years ago, so that a lot of what you read in the media has already been written by somebody else. Like they've sent a press release, and I didn't realize like a press release is pretty much the pre-written article, right? Then you send it to the media, and then they'll be like, "Oh yeah, we like that," and they might edit it, but it's mostly pre-written. Is that right?
Yeah, so what the media has changed a lot even in the last 3 or 4 years, and there's less and less, especially in New Zealand. So to get cut through on this, you really need to know what you're doing, and you need to grab their attention in the subject line and say, hey, news break in our interview with Andrew Mertens, or, that was the recent guest, so that's why I'm saying it. But then a really quick part at the top, hey, there's a big news break in this that I think would make for a good story. And then you might write it yourself, or you might just put a few of your quotes in there and say, here's the transcription of a really interesting part. If someone in your team wanted to pick it up, I think it would go well. But you've kind of got to have a bit of a nose for what works and what they're looking for, and what sites or papers are interested in different personalities. So there is a little bit of sort of in industry knowledge, but if you can find someone with that, and it's a good way of doing it.
That is the most valuable thing I've learned from this whole episode because I've never thought about that. And it applies to wherever you are in the world, whether you're a small regional podcast, or whether you do like, we've done a podcast before about knitting for somebody. It doesn't matter what the subject is because there will be a media outlet, whether it's a website or a blog, even if it's not like a traditional media, that you could be like, hey, I just had somebody on my podcast talk about this. And if you can get that on somebody else's blog or somebody else's outlet, wow. Yeah, no, that's unbelievable. I love that. I think that's the best place to finish. Steve, thank you so much. This has been so insightful, so amazing, inspiring. I'm really excited to go out and take some of these tips. Just remember for you listening, follow, subscribe, turn on notifications, do all those amazing things. Leave a review, rate it. And the best thing that you can do is share this episode with somebody else who makes podcasts, who wants to learn some valuable tips so that they can learn as well and help this podcast grow as well. So thank you for listening to Smarter Podcasting. Steve, thank you so, so much for coming on. This has been an incredible story, and I'm so excited to see your growth and where you're going to go next. I just love seeing other podcasters have such amazing success.
Cheers, Neil. It's been great. Yeah, it's been awesome to chat. A privilege coming on the show. So thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Cheers. Thank you.